Welcome to the place. This is a place for intellectual and spiritual and scriptural honesty. We are here on this Wednesday night. I'm applauding right now the teaching of Bob Graves. He did a masterful job teaching. He is the unconventional pastor, and I can't applaud him enough. There are many questions that have come our way. In fact, I've had to put off something that I wanted to do for Alan Darley, and I'm going to give you a date on this because tonight I had told Alan Darley that I was going to deal with all the linguistic issues pertaining to one particular lecture that was introduced, namely on our wall. And there is a linguist out of the UK, which hopefully will be with us here in a few months here at the place. He is going to be Skyping in from the UK, and he's a wonderful person, and we are lining these things up. And by the way, we just got confirmation that that Jim Palmer and Heather Palmer, they will be with us on our show as I think it's on the 2nd of December, if I'm not mistaken, Sunday night from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. Jim and Heather, they are wonderful. I mean, their relationship is powerful. Writings are powerful. And I might take some time tonight simply to read some of Jim Palmer's work, simply because he's making some inroads. He really is. He's suggesting some powerful points that I would rather you make application to. If you're looking for some kind of application, I would much rather you make application with some of the points that he's making from his books than most of the books of the Bible that we read. And I will explain that here in a few minutes. We also have a powerful guest who will be with us on the 18th on our show, The Place. He was on Inspiring Honesty this last week. His name is Augustin Astacio, and he's an ex-Jehovah's Witness. And when you listen to him, wow, this guy has a heart. This guy has a lot of honesty. He has the will to move forward. He's not stuck in his theology, and so he will be with us talking about his experiences of moving out of that particular movement called the, let's call it the movement of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And we're also going to call it the Watchtower Society. And he's going to explain to us all what that means to him. I do have some issues pertaining to the Jehovah's Witnesses and why I think their translation is extremely poor. I will do my best to give you a taste of some of the worst of what's called a translation that night, because I will pick on what has been done in the name of God, because it's been extremely foolish. Many things have been stated, and so maybe I can help Augustine out a little bit in encouraging people to move out of that mindset. We are not here to bash people, and sometimes I think that people think that we are simply bashing people, and that's unfortunate. What we're trying to do, or attempting to do, is to simply be intellectually honest. I think we've been lied to long enough. We've been told that stories like Abraham and his young son, who he took to the sacrificial altar and raised the knife and tried to kill him, and then the angel of the Lord stopped him. But please understand, God told him to do this. I keep saying that these stories about Abraham and his attempted murder, that is, of his son, is child abuse. And sometimes I get people who want to fuss and argue and say, no, this isn't child abuse. This was exactly what God wanted him to do, because if he would have killed his son, he would have raised his son from the dead 3 days later, because they see this as a type and a shadow of what took place with Jesus Christ. And that's unfortunate. the life and times of Abraham with his children in no way represent Jesus Christ at all. And that may be a shock to you, but we're going to explore Abraham and his life and demonstrate beyond question why Abraham is not even applauded by the Apostle Paul. That is, when you look at the Greek text. But one of the things that the Apostle Paul does make clear is that he was moving forward, but he had a long way to go. And so we have Abraham, who came out of the Ur of the Chaldees. We should say Avram, and then his name was changed, and most of you guys know the story because of his relationship with quote-unquote Yahweh. And Yahweh was this kind of God that, recently he had killed everyone on planet Earth except for 8 people, and so he was angry again, and so he had to have a certain group of people, and he needed certain people to say, you're my chosen people, and everybody else is damned. And so we're going to deal with that in another teaching, but not tonight. I want to talk about, in brief, some of the questions that have been coming in, because, and I needed to give you that date. The date that we're going to have a linguistic night will be on the 5th of December. Now, we have scheduled this to be a night for linguistics simply because so many people have been conned by what is actually called the Bible, that is in English. And the reason for so much talk about linguistics, it has to do with why we are making statements that X, Y, and Z can't be true when it comes to the Bible. And so I keep saying, and others like Bob Graves keep saying, that we do have extreme synthetic models of translation theory on the market, and that's not hyperbole. Very little of what we see in Bibles today are actually the quote-unquote Word of God. With that said, people keep asking the question, where do I go to get truth? Well, I think that this is the reason that we keep coming together. If we keep talking, if we keep reasoning, we're going to build a better model of theology, just like science is building a better model of science. And this comes with many people engaged in the process. And so we're encouraging not just academics, but lay people alike to get involved. Oftentimes we learn much more from lay people, common people, people who have common sense than we do from academics. Sometimes academics have more bias than not. And my point is, this is not a conversation for some people. This is a conversation for everyone. We welcome atheists and theists alike to come together, look at the evidence together, and have some discussions. And these discussions need to be respectful. They need to be in an atmosphere in which we can actually think. And if we can start thinking, maybe we can start moving forward. Let me give an example. If I said Greg Bray, now many of you guys know who Greg Bray is. He is the atheist in the New Covenant group. I applaud him. He's our resident atheist. He's very much part of the New Covenant group. And many people would say, what is the New Covenant group? Please don't think that words have meaning or this inherent system of meaning. Words have usage, not meaning. So when we name this entity, if you will, this group, as the New Covenant group, we did it with the intent of being, yes, all-inclusive, but our doctrine is not the doctrine of inclusion. Our fundamental purpose, we could call it our telic, if you will. There's a difference between a telic and something that's ekbactic. In other words, when you're looking at literature, you're trying to find the purpose or the intent. That's called the telic. If you're trying to find the consequent or the result of something, that's called looking for the ekbactic. And so we need to learn terms. We need to learn ideas and how to actually diagnose and render and rethink, different positions of theology. But let me state this about the New Covenant group. We included or asked Greg Bray to get involved in the New Covenant group to provide what he knew to be true, because he's a very well-educated gentleman. He's a person who is a biologist. He happens to be an atheist, which is not bad. It's like saying one person is a Baptist, the other guy, he is not. It's like saying one person is a Catholic, one person is a Muslim. They simply have different ways of looking at things. And so atheists do have, they're looking at the same evidence in some cases. And when we look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions, that's fine. We're really not worried about the labels. Labels, if they divide us, we will not be able to move forward. And it makes no sense to allow these labels to divide us. And so we simply are coming together, not allowing labels to divide us. We're going to respect theists and atheists alike, whatever your viewpoint is. We simply ask you to respect and use a system in which you can practice the discipline of intellectual honesty and spiritual honesty, whatever that means, and scriptural honesty, whatever that means. And notice it's for, not of. I'm not convinced that we are intellectually honest, and this is why we are going forward. We're trying to do this for the sake of intellectual honesty, spiritual and scriptural honesty. And so hopefully that helps. Now let me make this statement about Greg Bray. Greg Bray uses evocative language. Most atheists today use evocative language. What I mean by that is this, and I'm going to suggest that Paul, the Apostle Paul uses lots of evocative language. And the same thing is true with John. When he writes, he uses evocative language. What does that mean? When Greg Bray, on his show, the show called Inspiring Honesty, what does he talk about? He talks about faith. Now, is he talking about faith because he has faith? Well, maybe he has confidence in various areas of science, but that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about faith as used by people in religion. Because most people in religion have this thing that they call faith, and it's actually a system of pretending. And so Greg simply is questioning, why keep using a system or a method of pretending and calling it God's Word when you're simply pretending? So he has a valid argument. And so he's going to use the term faith. He's not using the term faith because he agrees with it. He's even going to use the Bible. He's going to use Bible quotes left and right, not because he agrees with it, but because he is questioning the Bible and all of its gloss and its fundamental ideas. Now, the Apostle Paul was much like that. He doesn't use the terms of Judaism because he agrees with Judaism. He uses the terms of Judaism to suggest that I'm not like that at all. And this is where the Bible is really mixed up when it comes to both Old and New Testaments. English translators, along with these redactors, these English guys who sit around and try to reconfigure all of the translations that have been done by the scholars, the linguists, they sit around and try to dovetail everything together so everything has unity. Please hear that term, unity. They are the ones who are guilty of trying to unify 66 books or possibly more books than that, because we have various kinds of various canons on the market today. And so our Bibles are simply put together by people who want to design unity. And what are they doing? They are not being honest. In other words, is it true? However many authors that we have in the Bible, we don't have just a handful of authors. We have many, many more authors than we have books in the Bible. For instance, the book of Genesis has so many different authors. And most people are not aware of that because most people in religion simply ascribe, the Torah the first 5 books of the Bible, starting with Bereshith or Genesis, they ascribe that to Moses himself. However, when you do higher forms of criticism, you will find that this is not just what we call the writings of Moses. These are the writings that were borrowed from other people, simply gathered together and put almost in a sense in a form of systematic theology, if you will. And so when you read the book of Genesis from the Hebrew text and examine the higher and lower forms of textual criticism, higher form simply means that you're looking at sourcing. Where did this come from? And you're dealing with those elements. Now, the lower forms of textual criticism have to do with internal evidences. And so when you look at both, you can see readily that this book didn't come from the same person or from people in the same generation, but came from people of other generations and sometimes even centuries apart. And so we find that it's not just other generations and centuries apart, but also from other ethnic groups. Like when you look at Ugaritic writings, you're going to find much of that in the book that we call Genesis. Now, why am I spending time talking about that? I keep saying that just as Greg Bray is using evocative language, he is going to evoke, if you will. He's going to get that response out of theist. His target is towards theist. He's trying to get theists to rethink what they're thinking about in the context of what they claim that faith is. And so he will use the term faith over and over again. He will use the term religion or possibly some other terms that we have throughout, our theological meta-language. My point is, this is the same thing that the Apostle Paul was doing in all of his writings. He was not attempting to say, let me applaud Judaism. He left Judaism, but he knew that he could not rescue people out of Judaism by not using its terms, nor could he make sense to other people who had heard about Judaism, who were influenced about the shaping of such a culture and such a religion without using those same terms. And for this reason and others, this is why we have huge problems when it comes to understanding the Bible. An example would be when we read the book that we call 1 John. We see in chapter 2, and I'm going to read from this Bible that the Baptists, that is the Southern Baptists, are advocating right now. This would be the Holman Christian Standard Bible. And it states, "My little children, I'm writing you these things so that you will not, or you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one." He goes on and he says, he himself is the propitiation. Now, when you look at that word propitiation, the thing that comes up, and many of your versions will say that this is not to be translated as propitiation. Now, the idea, as most people suggest in theology, this is actually an idea of satisfying. Satisfying who? This is satisfying God. So, in this particular context of John, if we read it with the understanding of current day theology, this is actually, and please hear this, this is actually Jesus actually propitiating the Father. And please understand that Trinity theology was invented to support the doctrine of penal substitution. Let me read something that was stated as a comment. There was a comment made, and it goes like this: penal substitution is an important part of the rich mystery of the cross. And I'm going to say that there couldn't be anything further from the truth. Penal substitution has nothing to do with the cross. Now, so many people are really, really advocating the doctrines of penal substitution, but penal substitution is an idea that came from the pagans. It was borrowed or plagiarized by the pagans, and it was used by various people. And translators have been under contract simply to pontificate these doctrines of atonement and propitiation, that is, to satisfy God or to actually use this idea of covering. Now let me deal with this word for a moment, because when you look at the term hilasmos, the Greek term here, certainly it's true that you could translate it as propitiation, and you could translate it as atonement. They don't mean the same thing. And so please understand that when you go to a dictionary, you don't have just, in most cases, you don't have just one usage of a term. You have multiple usages of a term. And please understand, based upon book size, the size of the book determines, how many usages are going to be put in that dictionary. And most of you guys understand that. If you have an abridged dictionary, it's going to use the most common usages of a term, very simple ones. But if you have an unabridged, it's going to go a little bit further. But don't be so naive as to think that a dictionary will have all usages of a term. Now, people who deal with dictionaries, these people who deal with lexicons and deal with how terms are used and record all of this data and make entries, this requires not just a book. This requires volumes, not just volumes, but libraries. And this is why it's wonderful today to have computers simply containing all of the data of all of these various works. Let me see if I can explain it to you this way. If I want to define up, I can go to an English dictionary, and I'm going to find a handful of usages. Up can mean a direction. It can mean something like this. And you guys who speak English will follow me. What are you up to? Well, they sent that man up the river. Notice how the usage changes the meaning of the term. Are you up to going to the doctor? He was sent up the river, and the direction up. Now, please understand that if we look at all of the usages to date, and there will be many more to come, it's like the word bad. At one point in history, we had no usage that actually implied that the word bad ever meant good. But someone became just excited one day and said, get down with your bad self, or use the term bad in a sense that meant good. And so an author, we are all authors of our own words. When we start speaking, we simply do it. Little kids, they make up words all the time that become a part of our vocabulary. They use terms differently that become a part of dictionaries in times future. And please understand this. Look at it this way, linguistically. So many people in religion will say, I've studied the etymological structure of the term or the diachronics of the term. Etymology means, if we deal with etymology, we're going to talk about its first usage. But don't go too far with that, because when you're dealing with ancient languages, what you're going to find is the first written usage, not the first usage. There's a big difference between the first oral usage and the first written usage. In other words, the first oral usage and the development of a language, please understand that First Temple Hebrew did not exist. That language had to evolve, and when it started evolving, it took a long period of time before they started writing things down. What did they start writing on? They started writing on bone, stone, and then later on animal hide. Now, since it took a long time, it was very, very difficult simply to write out a sentence. Now, what is a sentence? Well, in English, we count a sentence as actually a complete thought. Now, back in those days, they didn't look at it as a sentence, and they wrote as they spoke. It was very much a nominal language, and it's been very difficult to tell how these things took place. And so when these guys started writing, and if you can picture someone with a chisel, just go out to your local butcher and get the biggest bone that you can. Dry it out, take a chisel or some kind of sharp instrument, maybe an oyster shell, something like that, and try to write on it, and try to write meaning. Maybe, write a letter to someone and send that bone to them in the mail, and see if you don't get frustrated. Because when you're trying to author something on bone, it's difficult. Now, Joey, our executive producer, he gives me these large bones all the time, and he's trying to get me to write several of my books on these big bones. I'm joking with you. I'm simply saying it's a very crippled process. It's the kind of thing that you get frustrated with. And so you get so frustrated, you say, I'm not going to put my vowels in there. I'm just going to write consonants. And so you have oral language, and then you have the manufacturing, the inventing of consonants. And so you invent the consonants, and you're doing the best that you can. And some people would argue, that's not what I'm talking about. And you go left and right. And so by the time that we discover the first usage in written form, that term possibly could have had, 50, 60, 80 different usages. My point is, the usage of up has over 275 different usages. Many words have over 1,000 usages, but you won't see them in dictionaries. We just don't have enough room, even though we have all of these computers these days. But can you imagine living back in the days in which they were writing the Old Covenant on bone and on stone? How difficult it was? Oftentimes when I'm sitting down writing on a piece of paper, I'm writing and then I forget what I say, and then I can't even grasp what I've stated, and so I just mark out and keep going. Now, if I had to take as much time as they did simply to write down things, just think about how many thoughts that you would lose. And so it becomes very paracoptic in a sense. It becomes just one isolated bit and here and there, and just back and forth. And it's like fragmented sentences, if you will. It's like people using extremely bad English. That's very much what we have in the Old Testament. Now, let me state that again. The Old Covenant is comprised of extremely archaic language flux. It doesn't flow. These people are just learning to write and put things together. It doesn't have the kind of rhythm that you read. It's not in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's nothing like that. And by the way, people keep saying, well, I don't understand why you would claim that an abjad is what it is. An abjad is simply a writing system that has no vowels. And without vowel structure, you're not going to understand any language. And that's what we have in the Old Testament. Now, for the sake of argument, for those of you who would disagree with what I've stated in times past concerning an abjad, I would get you or ask you to consider the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is a pointed text. Now, if we did not need vowels, that is to understand the Old Testament writing system, we would not be keeping the Masoretic text around. But the reason that so many people are treasuring the value of the Masoretic text is because they can't understand anything without it. Now, the Masoretic vowel pointing system was developed from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew text. They borrowed the concepts of theology from the Septuagint, an accurate writing system, and terms that came not from. The Septuagint wasn't a translation of these Old Covenant writings. The Septuagint was actually a translation of oral tradition. Please hear what I'm saying, because when you look at the Septuagint and you try to match up language flux that fluent, and then you look at the Abjad, you're looking at something that's not there. And so we need to quit pretending. The Old Covenant doesn't have something that's extremely fluid. Now, I'm not suggesting that all the way through it's the same way. I'm saying that the beginnings of it are very, very clumsy, very poor, not possible to understand the intent, purpose. So the telic is missing, therefore the ekbactic is gone. And yet people today keep claiming this is the Word of God. What is my point? My point is, some of these people, like the Apostle Paul and John, they wanted to jerk people's chain, like Greg Bray. And I don't blame Greg for doing what he wants to do. He's simply trying to get you to relate to your faith. In order to relate to your faith, he has to use theistic terms. So he becomes evocative. Let me evoke this emotion, if you will. Let's talk about your faith, and let's bring up the substance. And much of the Bible was written that way. And I'm talking about the New Testament. The New Testament was not written for the sake of accuracy. For instance, when I was talking to Bob Graves the other day, when I was talking about that time period between the resurrection and the ascension of Christ, it wasn't 40 days. The term 40 was used because it was an evocative approach, because you have 40s throughout the system of theology called the Old Covenant. It was trying to get people to identify 40, 40, 40. You have terms like 3. I don't believe that Jesus was raised in 3 days. That's another teaching. That wasn't a 3-day period, but 3 days is a super number. It's a magic number, so let's pull it out of the air. Jesus never talked about this 3-day idea. When John wrote about 3 days, like in John chapter 2, that if you destroy this temple, I will raise it again in 3 days, that is John using evocative language to tie it in. In other words, he's badging. Let me badge my work by trying to get other Jews and other people reading my material. They're going to like my material if I use 3s. And please understand that numbers were connecting the dots for people in theology. So we have terms that these people will use in order to gain the interest of people who were thinking in theology, and they were trying to pull the crowd. They were trying to evoke emotion. That's what they were doing. And please understand, every time that you go to church, you're going to have someone behind the pulpit that's trying to evoke some kind of emotion, some kind of plea, trying to get you saved, whatever. It's just what it is, and we need to get honest about that. I'm not suggesting that religion alone has that. We have sacred cows everywhere that we are not willing to deal with. For instance, the Bible is a sacred cow. Religion is a sacred cow. Our military today is a sacred cow. Our political system is a sacred cow. We don't want to touch anything. We're afraid of being honest. We're afraid of being genuine or authentic about it all. And this is the reason that we have politicians who run today, and they use this same approach that religion has been using, because it works to gather lots of people together and fight for one position or another. They just use terms, buzz terms, if you will. And so when you look at the scripture, you have a lot of buzz terms. And so the question would be, are these buzz terms used simply to evoke emotion, or are some of these authors actually using the terms but using them differently? I contend that the Apostle Paul uses a style of juxtaposing. He uses the old covenant mindset that comes from this transmissional process that is oral. Please understand, the oral Torah preceded the written Torah. The oral Torah was put together systematically. The oral Torah is systematic theology, if you will. It isn't this direct revelation from God, thus saith the Lord thy God, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That did not happen. And the quicker that we start understanding that, we're going to be better off. What we have is actually an oral Torah that preceded the written Torah by centuries. And then the written comes, and then we have people today, oh, I have the etymology of this. Well, I have the first usage of this term. No, you don't. We don't know what the first usage was orally. The written first usage is much different in most cases than the first usage orally. Sometimes they can be the same, but it's a rare occasion. In most seminaries, these kinds of things are not even taught. But when you study linguistics, in other words, every Greek and Hebrew student, if they do not study linguistics, they are simply going to get into decoding, not translating, not legitimately dealing with how language actually works. And as a linguist, I keep encouraging people, we need to be language smart. Let me repeat that. I can't speak well tonight. Sugar's off a little bit, but that doesn't keep me from speaking. I'm going to keep speaking, and please understand, these other people had problems like I do. When my sugar is off, I may be chewing on my tongue, but I'm going to keep going. The same thing is true. Sometimes writers get writer's cramp. We all have problems trying to write things down, speak efficiently, do things like this. This is what we have. We have people throughout history, we have human beings attempting to say something that God said or what they perceive to be true about God, and some of it is simply just fabrication. Some of it may be good, and some of it may not be good. Some of it may be useful, and some of it may not be useful at all. And this is why Paul wrote to dear Timothy. All of this stuff is useful in the sense of letting us know something about the good and the bad and the ugly of it all. That's true. So when we start looking at the Bible itself, we need to start considering why does the Bible say this about Jesus becoming this atonement or this propitiation? Now, if I look at the term hilasmos is only used twice. That's important. Where's the other usage? Chapter 4 of the same book. Where are other usages so I can see something that would have some sense of concord or agreement? It's not there. So this is very specific, but he's using a term that does relate orally to something that has to do with another exchange, because we do have theological writings that have this in this. And so what is he doing? Is he appealing to something? Yes, he is. Does this have its finds in mythology? Yes, it does. Hilasmos has its finds in paganism big time. This term is used more in paganism than any other place. Wow. Why would he choose to do this? What is he doing? Is he talking about, Jesus becoming an atonement? No. A propitiation for our sins? Not at all. And so I'm not convinced that I'm going to get finished teaching tonight, but at least I'm going to stimulate you to start thinking about the text and the purpose in which these people had in using certain terms. Now, there's another term that I'd like to talk about. If we look at this term and terms that relate to it, another one would be hilaskomai. This is actually a middle voice verb. And in your Bibles, it has been treated at times as a part of this deponent complexity that I keep talking about. Let me share with you what a deponent is. When people started translating years ago from Greek into English, when they could not find an active voice, a verb, what they would do is they would simply say, wow, this term doesn't have an active voice. It's in the middle voice or the passive voice. Therefore, we are going to translate it as an active voice meaning. And so these people are saying, wow, we can just go ahead and put it into the active voice. Well, there are several problems with that. The middle voice verb in Greek has at least 20 different kinds of usages. It's not remotely similar to our middle voice. Our kind of English today, most English teachers will tell you avoid the middle voice, avoid the passive voice, only use the active voice. And so in proper English, if we can call it proper, I really despise the idea of boxing any kind of language. But my point is, it's rare that we find any kind of language usage in English that even advocates the passive usages and the middle voice. We normally go straight to the active. And so this becomes a complex thing. As a translator, and this is often what I've done to many of my students, there was a time in which I would say, let's, for the sake of argument, put people on an island. And these people only use the passive voice. And so it's your job to convey everything that you're saying in some kind of equivalent by writing what you think to be true in the passive voice. And this becomes very problematic. And then when I even say this, listen, I'm going to give you a lot of sentences that you have to convert, and I'm going to give you transitive verbs, I'm going to give you intransitive verbs, I'm even going to give you the acquative verb and let you deal with it. This becomes a very complex thing, and these people, these students of mine have just gone swimming. They go, wow, this is big. And this is where we are in the Greek text. And the problem here that I'm suggesting is that we have cognate forms, inflectional forms of this term that are used and that should be understood. And when we go to these terms, they have been wrongly translated simply because people have been using a system of Sanskrit. Sanskrit is that of the Indians. Those people of India, Sanskrit is part of that culture, not of Greek. And so in seminary, people are learning Sanskrit grammar, which really has little or nothing to do with Greek. It's like translating Spanish into English by using Russian grammar rules. I guess my point is, we've got a lot of work to do when it comes to understanding the Bible. I can sit here for hours and years and simply demonstrate one point after another as to why we should not trust our English Bibles at all. And for some reason, people keep calling me, well, what about this verse here? I can pick up the phone, and I've got a lot of text questions. What about this verse here? What about that verse there? Well, my first question is, the verses that you're questioning me about are these verses that are from an extremely failed synthetic model of translation theory. What I mean by that, if I ask a scientist, that is in a science lab or in a science room, if I ask the professor, I've got a question. I'm reading my flat earth science book, and I don't agree with what you're saying. My flat earth science book says something different. Can you explain this? The professor, if you keep asking that question, he's going to tell you, oh, why don't you put that book on the shelf? That's a failed system of science altogether. And the same is true in theology. We have extremely poor translations, and at some point, we need to encourage people, wow, if you're going to learn good science, you need to listen to professors of science, and let's get rid of the textbooks that are failed. What am I asking you to do tonight? I'm asking you to start rethinking the Bible like this. If it is this failed, and I claim that it is, and I don't know of any linguist that doesn't. It's just important to know that only a handful of us are willing to go through the hell of making it known. And please understand, we're going through hell simply making these things known. We're going against a lot of politics. The politics of religion are great. Simply to tell people that Jesus didn't atone for your sins, don't think that that comes without a cost. It does. Telling you that Jesus didn't die on a cross as this atoning sacrifice, this substitutionary death so you could go to heaven. I'm simply telling you that that's as big a lie as believing in hell. But unfortunately, church people are slow to change. Slow to change. The church is not encouraging atheists to come in and speak. They're not doing that. We have so many atheists who are brilliant, very honest. And if Jesus were sitting with me here tonight, he'd probably have hundreds of atheists sitting next to him because he simply wanted people to be honest and caring, compassionate. Jesus wasn't so arrogant that he wanted to be called God. He wasn't even interested in people crying out to God. He was more interested in getting people to understand how they needed to love one another, feed one another, clothe one another. So, if I keep dealing with this text, the first thing that I'm going to have to approach is if we draw all of these conclusions, in other words, if we take this abactic approach of utilizing a failed meta-language, if we look at the text of what we have in English and we keep forcing Dr. Jones and other linguists to keep teaching out of these models, are we going to move forward slowly or rapidly? And so, for the sake of argument, this is why I wanted to read a little bit of Jim Palmer tonight. Let me take the time to do so. And it'll take me just a moment to find this, but it was a powerful thing that he stated. And Joey, if you can find that before me. I'm trying to find it on my iPad. It's worth listening to. If you have a comment or question, go ahead and send it in, 850-572-7441. We're interested in you commenting. And please invite your friends to join our Facebook site. And also, please like the New Covenant group. That's going to help everyone. Son, if you would help me find that, I would appreciate it. I made a comment about Jim Palmer's work, and it was, okay, I found it. Okay, if you'll go to our wall, my wife and I's wall. Now, my wife is gorgeous. She's sitting in the back just looking so good, and I love to look at her. She's got those glasses on just looking so good. Yeah, it's wonderful. Now, we're going to have Jim and Heather on the show, and I can't wait. We love the Palmers. These people are so wonderful. But I want you to consider what I stated about Jim first. Then I want you to consider what Jim said. Because if you want something to really help you tonight, this is something that I think that you need to contemplate more than any passage in your English Bible. I hope you're listening to me. I want you to think about what I'm saying right here and now more than anything that you can find in your English Bible except for 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4 through 8. That's an efficient read in most Bibles. I want you to think about this. I wrote this. I advocate Jim Palmer's work because his writings are healthy, meaningful, and good. Let me repeat that. I advocate Jim Palmer's work because his writings are healthy, meaningful, and good. Now, this is what he wrote. 5 lines worth erasing in your life. I want you to listen to this. This is powerful. 5 lines worth erasing in your life. The line between sacred and secular. Just think about that. How many times, I want to ask my wife, how many times have I been called a secular humanist? She can't count that high. And she's an accountant. So, wow. So I need to erase the line between sacred and secular. That would be nice. I need to erase the line between us and them. Have you ever heard people get into the argument of us and them? Yeah, it does no good. So Jim is saying, get rid of the lines that are between sacred and secular, us and them. The line between divine and human. I love that one. Get rid of the line between divine and human. What would happen if we did that? My people back there on the switcher allowed the screen to go black a couple of times, but that's all right. We forgive them. The line between God and life. The line between the pretend you and the real you. What is Jim doing? He's taking 5 things basically that is stated here, and he has given you more substance here to move you forward than most of what you can find in most entire books out of any English Bible. Now, I'm not suggesting that the scripture is useless. I'm thinking that, wow, it's very useful. We need to be using our Bibles, but not our English translations so much. They are the equivalent of flat earth science. We need people like Bob Graves. You want to talk about someone who is writing something powerful? Let's read this. Bob Graves wrote this. I love this. His writings will do you more good than you sitting down reading the Bible. The whole notion of forgiveness is, in my opinion, unhealthy. Listen to Bob go. The whole notion of forgiveness is, in my opinion, unhealthy. It is unhealthy to hold a grudge, but it is also arrogant to forgive. We either reconcile with mutual respect or we do not reconcile and remain in separate paths. I think it is helpful to always be open to reconciliation, but reconciliation must be a genuine relational connection. It is not a negotiated official status. I wish that you guys would write that down and put holy in front of it, because it will do you a lot more good than the English translations that you're reading out of. Now, how did Bob come to that conclusion? Or these conclusions? He's coming to better conclusions because he keeps moving forward. The same thing is true with Jim Palmer. We've got a lot of people moving forward. These people are capable of examining the text and looking at the text and saying, we can learn from these various manuscripts, and yet at the same time, some of these guys were not getting everything right. They were simply trying to speak to their people, and it's very time sensitive and target sensitive, and they were even evoking emotion, trying to build an audience, if you will. Please don't think that John in 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, he's not trying to build an audience. He is. Don't think that Jim and Tammy Baker were the only ones guilty of trying to build an audience. St. John was guilty of building it much more than Jim and Tammy. What am I suggesting? We need to read some of these things. Look at this. Once again, Bob Graves, I am willing to reconcile with anyone, but if they take liberty to violate my boundaries repeatedly, they will discover I have a few conditional strings. Now, if you want to read the rest of it, you need to go to our page and look at the comments under the first thing that I read that Bob Graves posted on our timeline. What am I suggesting? I'm suggesting that we have writers and leaders today who are writing something that makes more sense, that's more genuine, more truthful than ever before. You want to read something powerful? Go to Greg Bray's page. He's an atheist. He's saying a lot more truth than a lot of the writers in the Bible. Now, I'm a theist. I'm not bashing the Bible. I'm being honest about the Bible. There's a difference between bashing the Bible and being honest about it. I'm being honest about the Bible, what the Bible is in English. I have no reason to lie. Now, we're putting a lot out on the line. We're getting a lot of heat for a lot of things. We have nothing to gain, that is, financially or any other way, in this contest of moving forward, in that sense of the word. Other people are simply parrots. They're simply parroting what other people are saying about, oh, this is God, this must be from God, and tying everything together. We're trying to educate you, trying to get you to think for yourselves. This is what the New Covenant group is about. It's about moving forward. It's about respect. It's about respecting those of the past. They had their concepts, but we equally respect people of today. To think that God doesn't think as much of Bob Graves and Greg Bray and Jim Palmer as he did the Apostle Paul is foolish. These men are just as important. And by the way, we have women that are writing so much. They are powerful. Women today are writing things that are so much better than men have ever written. I'm talking about the biblical authors. We have women who are excelling much in every way, especially my wife. Now, hopefully, I'm making some points. I'm going to go to my cell phone, and I'm going to look at a few comments. Hopefully, you guys have sat down and think about what I've been teaching. Keep it going. It's time to get sober. Relax about God, His love, and the Father of us all. Well, that's good. If you have any comments or questions, keep writing them in. I've got a list of questions that I have here, but I don't care to get into more questions tonight. Hopefully what I've said has been of some benefit to you. And so we're going to end up tonight with a song. and hopefully it's going to be a good one. So thank you for your time.